Joining me now are two journalists who have been investigating the Biden influence peddling from day one. New York Post columnist Miranda Devine and Peter Schweizer, president of the Government Accountability Institute. Both are best-selling authors as well. Must-reads on both of their books. Miranda, your thoughts on what we are going to see here and James Clapper rolling back what he meant in that letter signed right before the 2020 election.
Well, I mean, it's laughable what he's saying now, but he's only trying to sort of sidle out of the problem that he created for himself when he signed that dishonest letter, along with 50 other former high-level intelligence operatives, because now accountability is coming, now that the Republicans have control of the House and are determined to bring these people to book. We're looking at people like James Clapper and John Brennan and Michael Hayden, who have spent the last 2.5 years, following up their lies about Russian disinformation and about Hunter Biden's laptop being a Russian plant, which was a gift that they gave to then candidate Biden in the last debate against Donald Trump, when Joe Biden used that letter to say, this was a Russian plant. This is Russian disinformation. It's not real. And that worked for him. It got him off the hook. And that was the entire purpose of that letter. So it's just ridiculous now for James Clapper to be trying and saying, oh, that's not what we meant. Why did he not say anything when it was all over the front pages of all the newspapers that the laptop was, Russian disinformation? Why did he not speak up? He's now pretending, oh, he didn't know. He was on CNN. They were all on MSNBC every single day, just promoting that lie.
Yeah, in fact, John Ratcliffe, the former director of national intelligence, joined me this week on Fox Business Mornings with Maria, and he responded to Clapper's now cover-up. Watch this.
Those 51 intelligence officials knew precisely what they were doing. They were part of a narrative to mislead the American people, about that issue, to basically, override what I was saying as the voice of the intelligence community and what our own Department of Justice and FBI what were saying, which was Hunter Biden's laptop was not Russian disinformation. Everyone knows that to be the case now, but they intentionally, deliberately misled the American people for political reason. It's the definition of politicizing intelligence, and it's the definition of election interference.
Yeah, John Ratcliffe told us so right before the election, that what those 51 had written was not true. But look, you both have done incredible reporting on this subject. Peter, do you see any hope of justice here?
Yeah, I do. Look, I think the investigation is ongoing. I think the evidence continues to mount. And the Biden team will not answer a basic question, which is, when it comes to China, for example, you had 3 Chinese businessmen that funneled tens of millions of dollars to you. Each one of those 3, Che Feng, Henry Zhao, Chairman Yi, all had direct, abiding, and deep ties to Chinese intelligence when they were arranging these deals for the Bidens. And that's not me saying that. That's according to Hong Kong corporate records. They were business partners with the Vice Minister of State Security, who was responsible for foreign recruitment of spies. They were business partners with the former family of the director of the Ministry of State Security, which runs the entire spy apparatus. In the case of Chairman Yi, they actually worked as part of the spy apparatus. So what I would say is, some intrepid journalist needs to go to Jim Clapper and these other 50 intelligence experts and ask them, does this not have the hallmark of a Chinese intelligence operation?
Yeah.
And I think if they give you an honest answer, the answer would be yes.
Well, we're also looking at a picture of the diamond that was given to Hunter Biden by one of those men, right, Peter? 3.5-carat diamond? Is that money laundering?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that this grand jury is looking at. They're looking at money laundering. They're looking at FARA violations. They're looking at political corruption. But I think really the intelligence component of this, a lot of the people defending the Biden family are saying, well, show us the crime, which, of course, is a ridiculous standard. The question is is the family compromised? And you're talking about the flow of money, tens of millions of dollars to this family. There's no discernible service. They have still not explained what they actually got this money for. What were they doing in return in terms of a legitimate business enterprise? So it begs the question about this being an intelligence operation.
Well, Miranda, I'm wondering if this is still going on in plain sight. Hunter Biden is selling art, but the dealer will not tell us who's actually buying the art. Is it more Chinese officials tied to the CCP?
Well, that's the problem. We don't know. I think that the White House really bungled this when there were questions raised about Hunter Biden selling these paintings for, as a first-time patent for up to $500,000 each. And so their solution at the White House was to just make it non-transparent so that nobody knew who the buyers were. So yes, again, it opens them up. Again, it shows this incredible arrogance from the Biden family and from Joe Biden in particular to say, I'm honest, Joe. He said that on the debate stage against Donald Trump. He said, you know my character, you know his character, you know that I'm known for my honesty. Who do you trust? Well, unfortunately for him, I think the mythology of honest Joe is crumbling before our eyes. There are, undisputable lies that he's told. It's a terrible thing to say about a president, but it's obvious. And particularly when it comes to his involvement in his family's business dealings, we know it's recorded that he met with at least a dozen of Hunter's business partners, whether overseas in Beijing or whether in his own home in Washington, D.C., in the vice president's residence. And this was all going on while he was vice president.
Do you think there's any hope for justice? And I know that you also see a tie to the documents, the classified document scandal as well.
Yes, look, we've seen already at least two documents from the laptop look to be unusual, look to be Hunter Biden selling information that he's gleaned from his proximity to his father. We don't know whether that was classified information, but it certainly looks like, high-level official information. And he's been, selling it off on Russian oligarchs, selling it off to his Burisma partners. That's certainly what it looks like in return for being paid enormous sums of money. I mean, Burisma, the Ukrainian company, was paying him $83,000 a month for, in the period of 5 years, cut his salary in half when his father no longer was vice president. So I think that grand jury run by U.S. Attorney David Weiss in Delaware, it's taken now 5 years to look into Hunter's very complicated business dealings. And now that the classified documents scandal is showing a link with Joe Biden to his son's businesses, then you would imagine the special counsel, Robert Hur, should be liaising with David Weiss in Delaware.
Yeah.
If they don't, I think that the Republican House should be asking some pretty serious questions.
Yeah, and Peter, you have questions about a former FBI official, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, we had this report about an FBI agent charged with doing business with Russian oligarchs had been linked to Hunter Biden. But let's remember, the Biden family has a long history with former FBI Director Louis Freeh. When he was appointed FBI Director, one of his champions was Senator Joe Biden on the Judiciary Committee. When he left the FBI directorship, where did he set up his base of operations? Wilmington, Delaware. His kids went to Joe Biden's alma mater when Joe Biden was the head of the fundraising committee there. One of his first clients was MBNA, the big Delaware bank that is close to Joe Biden. Hunter Biden was working there at the time. And we know based on the laptop that Louis Freeh gave $100,000 to the Biden family for Joe Biden's grandchildren's college fund, and that Hunter was seeking to do business with Louis Freeh and referred business to Louis Freeh. So, with all these questions about the integrity of the FBI and law enforcement, Very simple question. I mean, has Louis Freeh been going to the Wilmington FBI office, which would be part of this grand jury investigation, part of the independent counsel investigation? Is he talking to anybody at the J. Edgar Hoover building? These are very serious concerns, and one of the reasons I've said from the beginning, going back to 2018, you have to have an independent counsel because Joe Biden has too many long-term friends in senior positions of law enforcement and at DOJ that could potentially influence this investigation.
And it sounds very similar to what we saw from the Clinton campaign, Miranda, when Hillary Clinton came up with the lie of Russia collusion.
It really does. And look, I'd just add with the FBI links that this latest scandal with Charles McGonigal, former very high-ranking head of counterterrorism in counterespionage in the New York field office, he has several links to Hunter Biden, including through one of the Albanians that was enriching Charles McGonigal.
Wow.
One of them was working for CEFC, which is that Chinese company that was paying the Bidens millions of dollars.
Yes, and that was the email that we all know of, 10% held by H for the big guy. Miranda Devine, Peter Schweizer, thank you so much.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.